Thanks for joining us again for this iteration of our RiskCon webinar series. We have two exciting speakers with us today. First is going to be Katie Mach, and second is going to be Kelly Hereid, who are going to share their perspectives on compound extremes and their own research and takes on it. Katharine is gonna start. She's a professor at the University of Miami, working on climate change risks, adaptation and response options to weather extremes, such as flooding, extreme heat, wildfire, and other hazards. And she was a chapter lead of the US 5th National Climate Assessment, also lead author of the IPCC 6th assessment report. And her research is looking into innovative approaches to integrating evidence and to take on effective and equitable adaptation methods of risks. And this is, I believe, what this talk is going to be about today. So if you want to share your slides, you can go ahead. And maybe just about the structure today, we'll have a talk, time for a very short set of questions, and then a joint discussion after both talks have finished. So very much looking forward.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kai, for that introduction, and Colin for the invitation in the first place. What I'm going to do is introduce the approach we've been taking to thinking about complex systems in the current version of the National Climate Assessment, so NCA 5. What I will also mention is that in the last go around, the National Climate Assessment that was so famously published on Black Friday, we all learned about it about 2 days before Black Friday, that NCA 4 was the first time there was a complex systems chapter. So all of us as authors on that report were really saying, how do we establish a starting point for bringing together so many interacting pieces across an assessment report and approach that's supposed to be relevant to policy and decision-making across scales, but where that integration had never happened explicitly in the report. Then we had the IPCC, and there are a few innovations that happened in the IPCC AR6 round that I'll mention briefly. And now what I'll do today is really emphasize where we've landed, second go around for complex systems, where we can be a lot more ambitious about not just what has been historically studied in the space of complex systems, but things that are starting to be incorporated, like equity, like governance, like managing the risks within a complex systems environment. So our chapter, which will be coming out for public review, probably next week. We're waiting on the federal agencies to sign on the dotted line that they approve our revisions for the last round. But all of you should be able to access the complex systems chapter that I will briefly introduce here sometime next week, and I will put it out on Twitter, and I'm sure there will be advertisement of it. So as you hear what I'm introducing, which will just be kind of a high-level overview of how we're organizing this assessment, keep your ideas for, yes, our discussion today, but we would love to get your comments on the chapter itself, the third order draft, as it's called. So our chapter is organized around 4 main pillars. The first one is really, what are the fundamental characteristics of complex systems, interactions between people and the environment, including the built environment, that are really foundational in this space. And I will just introduce this briefly in terms of how we've been seeing the arc of the entry points evolve through time. So this was our first go around, the 2018 4th National Climate Assessment. And, as Pat Reed described, our main goal here was just to say, no matter where you're starting, your landscape is connected to other sectors and drivers, right? You've got all of these non-climate influences, ranging from markets and technology to decline of the environment, connecting with climate-related influences, and historically, in terms of governance and decision-making, people have operated within these silos. So in 2018, our main point was it's connected. As some of you might be aware, there was a major effort to put together a multi-sector dynamics vision report, and it evolved this figure, but it still is basically the same thing. The main advance here was to say sectors are systems of systems, and that means that if you're starting from water, you've got governance and infrastructure and socioeconomics coming together, and you can kind of tease apart some of these systems that cut across all of the sectors. So that was where our launching point was for the current report, but we also brought in a lot of the advances that were simultaneously happening in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so this new version of the risk propeller figure, some of you are perhaps familiar with the IPCC risk propeller figure, where historically you'd say risk in a changing climate, the potential for adverse consequences where something of value is at stake and the outcome is uncertain, is a function of the hazards, which themselves can be compounding and cascading, sharp end of the climate systems, the droughts, the floods, the heat waves, but also interacting with the vulnerability of people, our infrastructural systems, our socioeconomic systems, and exposure, what is in the path of harm. But where we went in the IPCC, which is where we really have driven our current National Climate Assessment Complex Systems chapter, is to recognize that responses are central to complexity. It is not as if responses are easy, which in a way is kind of how decision-making options have historically been queued up through assessment processes. In fact, the risks of responses can be so severe that they may modulate everything happening in the space of climate risk. And sometimes the risk of responses can be so severe or so seemingly large that inaction is the default. So the last starting point for just the characteristics of complexity is recognizing that in these highly interconnected systems on which climate change is unfolding, we now need to look at the dynamic interactions, the potential for tipping points, the potential for sudden failures, where our responses, what we are doing in the public and private sector and across society, is inherent to this landscape. So in a way, this figure is where we have started in our current complex systems assessment. And our goal is really to put people at the center of complex systems, recognizing that responses, what people do, are perhaps the biggest goal in terms of what an assessment and policy relevant science aims to inform. And first of all, recognizing that people affected by climate making decisions that directly affect our emissions of heat trapping gases, how prepared we are for impacts that are occurring, or activities where people may not have historically even seen a connection to climate, but increasingly, as there is drought, intensifying floods, intensifying fires, activities that historically could be seen as separate from climate now increasingly have some level of climate relevance. This, of course, brings together all of the sectors. So again, our role in the NCA 5 assessment is to draw the connections that otherwise would fall through the cracks. And what I'll get to at the end of the presentation in terms of principles for governance, part of the challenge here is that you've got overlapping and nested scales of action occurring, where getting all of the action moving in the same direction together is phenomenally complex. We also bring in different ways of knowing, increasingly recognizing that the classic technocratic approach is to line up the science, but in terms of actions that actually happen, it is really a question of how that science interacts with local knowledge, experiences, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge as well. And then again, recognizing that it's not just the climate-related shocks and stressors, it's how climate-related shocks and stressors interact with so many things that go far beyond climate. So this is our entry point. We would love your feedback on this figure. We have thought hard about the options and tried out a bunch of different approaches. What would work for you when you're trying to communicate why complex systems matter as a foundational starting point for thinking about them? So everything else that we've done in the chapter departs from the history of what complex systems assessment has looked like in the National Climate Assessment or IPCC. And we're not departing from the scientific basis, but we are departing from what historically has been modeled and analyzed most directly within the complex system space. So the second main pillar that we put forward is really a hard look at the distribution of vulnerability and outcomes in complex systems. And you could almost say, just if we were to be really simplistic, the history of climate modeling, the history of impact modeling often has been geared towards best estimates with really ferocious tails in terms of what may occur, and quantifying those tails very, very difficult across different circumstances. And so you might argue that we know best about the central tendency, the best estimate, as compared to the full range of outcomes occurring in society. So here's our framing figure. Again, another figure through which we have done many, many drafts, and would love your feedback in this presentation, but also on the 3OD draft itself, where we basically say there are many different groups in society that can be distinguished by different features of intersectional identity. Maybe that's gender or class or race and ethnicity or age or disability. And then you've got kind of complex systems, everything we just walked through, coming together relevant to climate impacts and responses. And the basic rub is that when you have groups that are already vulnerable and systems that quite easily can perpetuate inequity, the lived experiences of a changing climate are really quite different. And the differences in these lived experiences have historically been off the radar of complex systems modeling and analysis, and also decision making. So this can relate to unequal exposure. Who ends up living in a floodplain and why? Is that unequal exposure because of where the levees are built or where people are encouraged to live? How does that differ across coastal flooding that may carry a lot of amenity as compared to inland flooding across rivers or little creeks with a lot of mosquitoes? The ways in which often our processes of disaster relief, climate resilience, climate adaptation have benefited some more than others, and the degree to which the cumulative burden can really add up. So the ways repeated disaster cycles, for example, lead to much more substantial impacts for low wealth marginalized communities. I'm going to walk through this through one example that is quite close to home, and then I'll conclude this second section with a few bigger picture reflections. So this is where I am right now. I'm in Miami. And you could say that the history of climate responses in Miami has historically looked most of all at two things. Number one, the profound history of economic development, the real estate industry that has transformed this region over the last century. And number two, what happens to all of this development under rising seas, this showing disaster type flooding with 1 meter of sea level rise in the region, with the different colors showing the depth of flooding. There's breathtaking exposure to flooding, and especially flooding under sea level rise. The highest point in the county is about 30 feet on the ridge. Okay, so against this backdrop, everyone has focused on flooding and sea level rise historically. But increasingly, as climate responses are occurring, there's been a rise in attention to heat. So why has heat historically been off the radar? The conventional wisdom is that, yes, this is a very hot and humid climate, but it's one where we have air conditioning. I've got the air conditioning going right now. But for example, when it comes to all of that intersectionality that I was walking through in our twisted corkscrew figure, first of all, the question is, which neighborhoods have tree canopy cover? Are you in Little Havana with very little tree canopy cover, or Coral Gables or Coconut Grove with a lot of tree canopy cover? Next, what is your energy insecurity like? Are you able to afford to turn on air conditioning in your home as much as you need to? Third, are you a renter and faced with very poorly maintained infrastructure or building insulation that is just brutal in terms of how much energy is required to have a hope of keeping the space cool? And what's really interesting is, as climate responses are unfolding, a lot of these lived experiences are surfacing and really starting to shape what research is being done, which I'll come back to in a second. But where we kind of close in this section of the chapter is to recognize that many strategies in the space of climate responses that have aimed to address the distribution of vulnerability and impacts to date have focused very heavily on procedural equity. So is there engagement? Are processes geared towards building capacities? I put this in all caps and bold to emphasize it is what has happened most in climate responses to date. There actually has been relatively little focus, which has been empirically documented, on actually addressing the ways in which climate change and climate responses are continuing to redistribute resources, often to the benefit of higher wealth individuals, less marginalized individuals, and the degree to which structural reforms in these complex systems to address the silos, to address institutions that are perpetuating inequity. These two might be the most fundamental for addressing the distribution of vulnerability and impacts, yet they haven't really been emphasized to date. And so you might say that kind of the history of climate responses is down here. Neoliberal city, you could call this disaster capitalism, where after climate shocks and stressors occur or long-term enduring challenges, there are a lot of profits to be made, and oftentimes those profits are going to some, not all, and most vulnerable groups can literally be physically displaced from regions. You might then say that early adaptation efforts across the US have been more in this space, where responses are serving to benefit some more than others. There's a risk of focusing on equity, but not actually addressing root drivers, which doesn't get us that far in terms of really moving towards adaptation. And then this kind of elusive question of, can we achieve a different approach where frontline communities are centered to a much greater degree, where there's a deeper view of collective well-being and sustainability when it comes to our investments in climate mitigation and adaptation. So that's the second section of our chapter. I'll briefly hit now our last two. So in the spirit of centering people in complex systems, we really wanted to emphasize kind of the how. What is the nexus between how we are producing knowledge on complex systems and what it means to make that knowledge more useful for decision making? And what we basically do is first kind of think about the many different levels at which knowledge becomes relevant, how they interact, and then what's the nature of the data. So first, I'll just say on the right here, going from individual to global scales, we have a few different examples of all of the types of complex systems knowledge that come into play. Data, observations, modeling, decision support, a range of tools, things that can be case studies, notional scenarios, quantitative scenarios, also things like art and culture and norms that oftentimes are more in kind of the space of local knowledge as compared to scientific knowledge. And here we have the basic rub of complexity, that everything interacts. You've got government at every possible level, shaping policies that determine ultimately, profoundly, our emissions of heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, some of our bigger policy-based, institutional, collective adaptation actions. But then you've got people perceiving climate change, affecting what happens in the space of government. This can also be within the private sector, taking actions individually or at the level of firms, taking actions also in the space of adaptation. And so what we basically put forth, based on a whole lot of research in this space of how knowledge is produced and used, how knowledge becomes usable, becomes actionable, is that there are deliberately participatory and collaborative approaches that can be tapped to help address complexity, really kind of accommodating the range of competing perspectives that exist in any complex system, addressing the uncertainties that can be really deep, increasing the use of knowledge, improving outcomes, and also improving what research happens to better speak to the challenges of decision making. We walk through the fact that there is a very large range of approaches that can be applied. This figure is not in our report, but it's one that I've thought about in terms of visualizing the diversity, where you could say in the space of engaged research can range from contractual relationships, consulting, for example, to very deep, ongoing, decadal-long examples of co-production. And these different forms of research aiming to make more knowledge more actionable within really complex systems will differ in terms of who's coming up with the question, the nature of the relationship. Is it a long-term partnership or a one-time contract? And whether the interaction over time is just setting up a contract or recognizing that the risks and the goals may not be understood and there needs to be evolution through time around that. In the chapter, we walk through a lot the ways in which different actors play out through the course of engagement and co-production. For example, the crucial role of boundary agencies or climate service providers, recognizing that those of us that are researchers or those of us that are practitioners really may not be able to cover all of the space of interactions that need to occur. The other thing we emphasize heavily is that evaluation of actionable knowledge. Is the knowledge working for people making decisions? Is it usable? Does it fit their decision context? Evaluation of actionable knowledge, especially for complex systems context, has been extremely limited to date. So kind of understanding what can we transfer from one context to another in terms of setting up a process of actionable knowledge. What is the impact of processes trying to make knowledge usable for decision making? What are the consequences in terms of equity? All of those are really wide open questions. And so this figure is just kind of one example of how to think about evaluating actionable knowledge processes. What's the nature of interactions between researchers and practitioners? Does everyone view those relationships as equitable? Is usable knowledge resulting? And they're kind of deliberate mechanisms of evaluation, drawing from disciplines that go far beyond what was historically considered climate science, that can be really relevant and are increasingly being required by funders, as well as being deployed across contexts of government, community organizations, and research as well. So we close the chapter with a very new section where we basically put forth principles for managing complex systems. We've got knowledge gaps here because there are a lot of uncertainties about these principles. It's fair to say that the current governance for complex systems involves basically every level of government, also special bodies, coordinating mechanisms. It involves the private sector, involves civil society, individuals, as well as community organizations. And in the space of complex systems, resolving the conflicts of wide-ranging climate challenges and localized stressors is profoundly difficult. And our headline conclusion here is that we really only have preliminary evidence of what works, and there's a great need to learn to be able to scale governance that works. So I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by governance being super complex, and then I'll close out with the principles that we put forward. So this is the San Francisco Bay, a region highly exposed to sea level rise, as is the case for most delta regions globally. And if we ask, what does governance of sea level rise adaptation look like in this region? It's been changing wildly through time. So this first network map here shows connections between 82 policy actors, so governments, community organizations, special entities, interacting through 9 different forums, the little diamond. So that was around 1991 to 2007, 82 actors, 9 forums. If you jump to, let's bring this out to 2016, so just about a decade difference, here we now have 647 policy actors taking action related to adapting to sea level rise, 647 compared to 82 across 103 policy forums. So there is, a true abundance of governance happening. And this type of expansion, you could point to this for virtually any context of climate response, domestically, internationally, where there's recognition of climate challenges and people are trying to figure out how to make it work. In terms of how all of these actors are actually interacting, there are a lot of uncertainties. So I won't go through this figure in great depth, but just to say, you can take a figure like the one I gave previously and really start to analyze what's the nature of the interactions that are happening now. Some of them, in terms of what we know about governance, are going to promote learning. Some will promote cooperation, and some will promote coordination across scales. So, whether it's San Francisco Bay, where this has actually been studied, or all of the different contexts where it has not been studied, we're really seeing that there's a lot of complexity here when it comes to solving collective action challenges. And for the San Francisco Bay one, for example, I'll just do this figure briefly. You basically can look at who is interacting with whom and how: local actors through local forums, local actors engaging in regional forums, regional, local, regional, regional. And if we look at those different time steps I gave previously, sea level rise adaptation started as a highly regional endeavor in the San Francisco Bay. But over time, the number of regional actors increased but local actors went way up. And so in terms of this shift through time, what has actually happened is that local ties, local level action has come to dominate, with now the regional actors engaging locally as compared to everyone looking at bay-wide action, for example. So we introduced both technical tools as well as principles. In the space of technical tools, we look at things like the range of collaborative decision-making under deep uncertainty approaches that are emerging. For example, pushing towards flexible adaptation pathways, decision scaling, methods that are really geared towards addressing the deeper uncertainties, failures and surprises, the potential for rapid change. So probably some of you have seen this type of figure before. I'll walk through it briefly. You could say, this one is from the IPCC. You could say that there are broad categories of action that can be taken. For example, to address sea level rise, you can advance out into the path of harm. This may sound crazy, but we actually have filled in delta regions and wetlands globally, so it actually is very commonly applied. We can build seawalls and levees to keep water out. We can work at the household scale or at the regional scale to enable water to come into the built environment, or we can move out of areas that we have previously developed. And the basic idea with adaptive pathways is recognizing that there are some responses where we can get to another response approach through time, others that create a lot of lock-in, and yet others where we know that at a certain point, protection, for example, here in South Florida, which is a porous bedrock, is not going to solve the full problem. And so the nice thing about this type of adaptive pathways approach is you're saying, where are we right now? What are ways to address short-term risks? And how do those interact with how we might address some of the more worst-case outcomes that could emerge through time? In our NCA 5 chapter, we take this a little further. We simplify it, given the goal of having highly accessible figures. And the main point we want to emphasize here is that both of those two things I just visualized are happening simultaneously. You've got the evolution of governance, like in the San Francisco Bay, happening in almost every context. So this process here, how people are interacting with response options and evidence, is evolving through time, at the same time that we've got these kind of more technocratic methods of doing evidence-based decision-making. And just to close out, our principles fall in terms of 5 different categories. So number 1, how to address deep uncertainty. It's things like pushing for transparency. It's deliberately building in redundancy. So if one thing fails, the whole system doesn't go down. It's building in flexibility, like those dynamic adaptive pathways, really saying, what does it mean to avoid worst case outcomes at the same time that current actions are beneficial? Number 2, in almost any complex systems context, there are multiple competing objectives. How do you deal with those? Oftentimes it's being really explicit about multiple criteria for evaluation. It's deliberately tapping inclusive governance and engagement to make sure the competing objectives are surfaced and not just having some of them being suppressed. Third, there's the challenge of the very widely ranging decision-making contexts that are relevant. This is not like we can just give a single agency authority to deal with climate adaptation or climate mitigation. It's action across so many different people, recognizing that then best practices can involve data sharing, decision coordination, de-siloing, in some cases using markets to help coordinate across many different actors simultaneously. Next, as I mentioned, given all of the different levels of government, geographies interacting, there's kind of the concept of nesting. What does it mean to support coordination across jurisdictions, clarify where boundaries are such that everyone can act better, also tapping tools like regulations and coordination of budgets. And then last of all, the feedbacks and the path dependencies. Feedbacks, one thing we really hit hard in the chapter is that often those are the hardest to foresee in terms of modeling. We generally underpredict rapid failures. Path dependencies, on the flip side, might be what are most hard to overcome in the space of decision-making. What may have short-term rewards may not work for the long term. And so kind of in this space of feedbacks and path dependencies, principles for governance really relate to repeated iterative monitoring, evaluation, and adjustment, even though that can be so hard to achieve in governance. Okay, that is all I've got.
Well, thanks so much, Katharine. That was Katie. Sorry, that yeah, that was really wonderful and gives a lot to chew on. Does anyone have a sort of clarifying question, or if not, we will move to Kelly's talk and then discuss subsequently. Yeah, and just a live clap is there as well. Okay, it seems like we'll move on to Kelly's talk, and yeah, happy to discuss, past the top of the next hour here, maybe 10 or 15 minutes past, depending on people's stamina. But I think, yeah, there'll be quite a lot to talk about. So Kelly Hereid is is the director of catastrophe R&D at Liberty Mutual Insurance. And she is interesting because she has a background in both geology and kind of climate science. She studied ENSO. And of course, now is kind of an expert on financial markets and risk and how to talk to people who don't know as much about climate as most of us do. And so, yeah, she's familiar with a lot of different hazards and a lot of different geographic and temporal scales, and yeah, brings a unique perspective, I think, in these kind of forums. So, Kelly, really excited to see what you have to say.
Well, fantastic. Thanks for having me. I also have no idea how someone who studied 1,000-year-old dead corals ended up in the insurance sector, but here we are. And here I've stayed for about the last decade now. So what I'm going to be talking about today is specifically what I see as a particular strength that the financial sector can actually bring to the climate adaptation problem. So when I say, I'm going to be talking about climate adaptation here today, I want to draw the distinction between climate mitigation, which has rightly a very large amount of the attention on how we will manage the climate, the climate problem, right? But I think it's also worth kind of stepping back every once in a while and seeing where we are and what our future pathways look like. So there is a substantial amount of warming that is already baked into our global climate system, of course, a little over a degree. We definitely want to be investing in mitigation so we don't end up here at the top part of the chart, but we have quite a lot of warming that is essentially probably going to be coming down the pipe. So how do we help to make our society more adapted and more resilient to the changes in extreme events, both in their frequency, distribution, character, that are already here now at a degree and will likely be continuing going into the future? So the way that I'm going to be approaching this is through three big concepts today. I will be talking about critical thresholds, so places where small changes in hazard can cause outsized changes in impacts. I'll be talking about loss multipliers and loss reducers, things that we can do in the built environment that can exacerbate or minimize the impact of a hazard. And lastly, I'm going to spend some time on building codes, which, everybody's like, oh, building codes. You're already like, okay, I'm going to sleep, I'm leaving now. But this is actually an area where the insurance sector in particular has decades of experience in understanding how our built environment reacts to different types of disasters, and that there's a lot that we can do to minimize sort of these societal impacts of hazards. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about today is critical thresholds. And, I get a little salty with people when we talk about things like there are chronic climate hazards and there are acute climate hazards. And the chronic hazards are things like changes in temperature and changes in sea level, because in fact, those chronic changes drive big changes in the frequency and distribution of extreme events. So this is a very simple and in some ways a very straightforward study that we did in conjunction with the flood modeling firm Fathom, where we looked at a book of business and said, how does sea level rise change our coastal flood frequency? Again, relatively straightforward question. You expect it to increase coastal flood frequency, and indeed it does. But the way that the financial sector thinks about increase in frequency, another way of putting it is that it changes the return period of events. It makes them shorter. And this is true both for relatively high frequency events up at the top. A 1 in 20 year event across our portfolio now looks more like a 1 in 5. So you get progressively more frequent. And similarly, this also applies for very extreme events. A 1 in 250 year event, a very extreme sort of hurricane driven storm surge, now looks more like a 1 in 100 year event in 2050. Of course, this is scenario dependent, but we're only looking out to roughly 2050. So there's not a huge amount of sensitivity in the timeframes where the insurance industry is making decisions as to like having to nail down the ultra specific details of sea level rise to get these high level conclusions. But the reason why I want to frame this in terms of return period is because it turns out that much of our critical infrastructure and our built environment has design standards that are similarly framed around return period. So for example, the New Orleans metropolitan area invested something on the order of, I don't know, north of $14 billion in upgrading its levee infrastructure in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, such that the city of New Orleans is now protected to roughly a 1 in 100-year event. So again, this is looking at some of Liberty's portfolio, but the broader concept stands here, where the areas outlined in green in the map on the left are now protected to a 1 in 100-year flood event. So if you have a 1 in 100-year storm surge, the metropolitan area of New Orleans largely stays dry. And indeed, this verified actually pretty well during Hurricane Ida, where downtown New Orleans stayed pretty dry, but that area sort of up to the top left actually did flood pretty substantially. And it turns out they had actually just broken ground on their own levee upgrade roughly a month before Hurricane Ida made landfall. However, look what happens when you advance only a short amount of time into the future. For the same intensity of event, now you still have that levee system, but now that 1 in 100-year levee has a couple of extra inches of sea level rise. So maybe it's only protecting from the 1 in 90-year event or the 1 in 85-year event. So now for exactly the same intensity of extreme event, a 1 in 100-year storm surge, assuming nothing changes about your distribution of events, now your likelihood of overtopping those levees and putting you at risk of a catastrophic levee failure has increased. So if you're an individual homeowner who's sitting in the middle of New Orleans, even though sea level rise has only changed a few inches, your individual risk might go from 0 to 8 feet of depth for the identical event. So these sharp discontinuities in risk, these step functions in risk with very small changes in hazard, are an example of these kinds of critical thresholds. And these are really baked in all throughout our built environment. This is one of my favorite examples, and I'm going to bring it up. Those of you who perhaps have heard me speak before have probably seen this before, but it's a 10-year Sandyversary just a few days ago, so I'm going to bring it up again. So these are the top 10 high water events that have ever been recorded in Lower Manhattan, where the high water events come from a variety of different storm surge causing events. They come from hurricanes, they come from nor'easters. But in each one of these events, it's broken down into the tide, whether it's high tide or low tide when the storm came in, the proportion of that high water event that's attributable to sea level rise, and then the wind-driven portion of the event. The reason why I like this figure so much is that it has this little line across here that says at 10.5 feet, the New York subway system floods. And what we learned during Hurricane Sandy is that when you put salt water on century-old electrical equipment, you take a damaging event in the New York metropolitan area and you turn it into a catastrophic one. That is where there is a massive dislocation in your level of risk for that metropolitan area. So in 2012, Sandy was going into the subway system pretty much no matter what. It was just an enormous storm. It was going into the subways. New York City has spent a lot of effort on reducing its risk since then. But what I get really interested in is a storm like Hurricane Donna, which in 1960 was just below this threshold. But if you add on the amount of sea level rise that has happened in the 60 years since Hurricane Donna hit, touch nothing else about the storm, don't change the storm surge at all, change nothing about its intensity. All you've done is increase sea level. You are essentially putting that storm at the mouth of the New York City subway system. You are taking a historical event and making it much more likely that that risk becomes catastrophic for the metropolitan area. And these storm surge return periods are not just built into, the return periods are not just built into things like levees. They're also inherently baked into things like stormwater management, as we've learned for, again, storms like Hurricane Ida, where, as you can see on the left, the return period of flooding associated with that hurricane in many cases was in excess of 1,000 years over a very densely populated metropolitan area, where the video on the right shows what happens when you have stormwater infrastructure that is not designed for that intensity of event. So if we expect these very intense events to be increasing in the future, we need to be thinking about sort of the design standards of that critical infrastructure to make sure that we don't run into situations like what you see on the right again. So those are some examples of these critical thresholds. Now I want to talk about how the decisions that we make within our built environment can either multiply risk or reduce risk due to the choices that we're making. So the most famous example of this is probably people just build more in harm's way, right? That you hear this song over and over again. So this is an example of Cape Coral, which just got impacted by Hurricane Ian, which the picture on the left is what it looked like in 1959, and the picture on the right is what it looks like today. We just are putting more people in high-risk areas, and that alone, setting aside climate change, will enhance your potential for loss. And then you add climate change on top of it, and of course, compounds the risk. But I also want to, again, take us back to that question of infrastructure. So this is nighttime lights data of what New Orleans looks like on a normal day, and this is what it looked like in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. So there were weeks of power outages because the transmission system failed in Hurricane Ida. And interestingly, even though the hurricane made landfall as a Category 4, people think, you know, wind is what's going to cause most of the health and safety, the life and safety impacts of a hurricane. There were actually more people who died in the aftermath from the power outages because it was followed by a very large heat wave. You had no power, no air conditioning, and vulnerable populations are very much at risk when this happens. So if you imagine this from a climate adaptation standpoint, you know, as a scientist, we tend to focus on things like how many hurricanes are there going to be in the Atlantic Basin and how will that change with climate change? But if I want to reduce the likelihood of people being harmed by a hurricane in the New Orleans metro, I sure want to know how often you're going to get wind speeds that exceed the design standards of those transmission lines. Because that is a point where you get these critical cascading and compounding failures that impact people much more broadly and exacerbate both the health and safety as well as the economic losses and dislocation in the aftermath of disaster. Doing these sorts of scenario analyses, like what I've been showing that we've been working on at Liberty, can also help us think through compounding hazards that we can use what we've seen in past events to think through how very large disasters tend to have multiple disasters start piling up on top of that. And this is a really good example from the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, where because the flooding associated with Harvey was so incredibly extreme, that it actually started causing hazardous waste leaks in many of the industrial facilities that are located around Houston. So this is an example of a refinery that, you know, the facility flooded. It was not prepared for the amount of flooding that it got during Hurricane Harvey, which 5 feet, most places weren't. But it released benzene, which is a potent carcinogen, into the surrounding socioeconomically vulnerable community. So using our understanding of disaster impacts, it can help us think through problems of climate equity and where these situations are likely to happen in the future. So if we can identify that and work with, you know, these high-risk facilities that are more likely to have these kind of compounding hazards, it gives us an opportunity to head off this kind of disaster before it happens. And then, you know, I mean, we talk a lot about flood risk, and flood risk is very close to my heart, but I think it's also important to talk about some of the other climate-related hazards that we have to deal with and the ways that we can understand the value that things like ecosystem services can bring to risk enhancement or risk reduction. And this is an area where right now it's kind of serving risk enhancement, but there's a lot of potential for risk reduction. So we've had a massive increase in particularly the area that has been burned in wildfires in recent years in the Western US and Canada, but these forests are historically adapted to fire. So this is a tree ring that was recovered from near a major burn site in Canada, where the little black marks that you can see on the side of the tree are actually burn scars. They're indications that this tree for centuries burned once every 25 or 30 years. Up until the last one happened in 1896, right around the turn of the century is when fire management practices throughout the West changed, that I believe it's called the 10 a.m. rule, that every fire had to be put out by 10 a.m. the next day, and that tree never burned again. So the obvious thing that's changed here is that the frequency of fire that you see recorded by this tree has dramatically changed. What may be less obvious is that this tree survived every one of those prior fires. Now, granted, there's some obvious survivorship bias here that this is the tree that we were able to see, but there's quite a lot of indication that it's not just that there was more fire in the past, but also that that fire behaved differently. And the reason why that's the case is that you get this massive buildup of fuel load because of the fact that we have changed these fire management practices so dramatically from what they looked like in the past. Katie mentioned the taking into account sort of indigenous and local knowledge. This is one of the most sort of high impact areas that we can be learning more about this. So this is some imagery from the aftermath of the bootleg fire from Missouri. I always want to call it the boot heel fire. The bootleg fire, where this entire area that you see in this image burned, but the area on the left had not had anything done to it. It was sort of allowed to grow as it would. The area on the right had thinning and prescribed burns and other sort of common forest management practices. So even though the entire area burned, the intensity of the fire, allowing that forest on the right to survive, was dramatically different. And this is important because very intense fires actually get so severe that they can start to generate their own local weather system. So this is an example of infrared imagery of a fire tornado from the Dixie Fire. So the fire is so intense, it generates its own local weather, which makes it incredibly unpredictable and dangerous to approach. And this is important because wildfire is one of our most defended perils. There's a lot that can be done to protect life and safety and property if wildland firefighters can get in and access the fire before it causes damage. But to be able to do that, we have to set them up for success. We need to think about forest management practices in a way that fires are going to happen. They are part of the landscape. So how can we reduce the severity and intensity of fires to allow them to safely approach and protect people's homes and properties? So the last part I'm going to be talking about is building codes. I know it's okay. Everybody go to sleep. I'll wake up in 10 minutes. No. So building codes are the most powerful adaptation measure that the insurance industry can bring to the table. So I'm not going to talk about the details of how we do catastrophe modeling. These are the tools that my industry uses. We can talk about them in the discussion if anyone is interested in the details. But what they have that is unique relative to sort of the more commonly used climate models out in the rest of the scientific sector is that they have detailed information about building stock. So 3 million locations of single family homes, they're wood frame, they're 2 stories, and vulnerability. How likely is a structure to be damaged for a given type of extreme event? And those 2 pieces of information are incredibly powerful if you can apply them to changes in hazard that we're learning about that are associated with climate change. So this is an example of Miami Beach, where we look at how the built environment has changed from the picture on the left, which was just before the Great Miami Hurricane struck as a Category 4, and the picture on the right, which is how Miami Beach looks roughly today. The obvious thing in this picture is that there's way more stuff in the picture on the right, right? Losses will go up because more people are building in harm's way, and that's true. But what may be less obvious is that that little hotel that you see on the left picture is much more vulnerable to wind damage than any one of those structures that you see in the picture on the right. So what you have are 2 competing factors: more exposure, more stuff being built, but lower vulnerability, less damage for the same amount of hazard. So catastrophe models can help us to tease out the interplay between those 2 factors, and it can allow us to run experiments. What would it look like if the entire US built its homes the way that Florida's very strict building code does? We can actually quantify those economic benefits of adaptation so that we can make a powerful case to policymakers to invest in that climate adaptation for their communities. And this is really important because how we experience disasters is very strongly influenced by the built environment. And what we've learned from the social sciences is that the easy answer that we give of, oh, well, there's a hurricane, just evacuate out of the way. We know that that does not include our most vulnerable communities, that they don't have the resources or the time or the access to be able to get out of the way of big disasters. But this adaptation does not have to be expensive, and it can help make sure that vulnerable communities have a home to come back to. So this is the aftermath of Hurricane Michael. As an insurer, I look at this picture and I see all these roofs missing over here on like many of these homes on the right. When the roof is gone, that building is a total loss, because then you have wind comes in, water comes in, it ruins all of your contents, you have to rip out all your drywall. But you'll notice in the center of this picture, there are 5 little white roofs. Those white roofs are white metal roofs put in place by Habitat for Humanity, which builds to a building standard called the Fortified Standard that's recommended by a nonprofit research group associated with the insurance industry, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And these homes survived a Category 5 landfall with minimal damage. We can build effectively for the climate hazards that we know are coming. And we actually are seeing a natural experiment play out with this right now. The city of Punta Gorda in Southwest Florida has had the misfortune of going through not 1, but 2 Category 4 eye walls in the last 20 years. So they were hit by Hurricane Charlie in 2004, and they were just hit again by Hurricane Ian a few weeks ago. So when I look at this picture, you see a lot of tree damage, so that looks a little bit rough. But what I love about this picture is that I see just scads of beautiful, shining metal hip roofs as far as you can see. Every one of those roofs that you see that's attached is a home that was likely saved by the Florida Building Code. Because I will tell you, the pictures that came out of this exact same city in 2004 look nothing like what you see here today. So this is real-time adaptation and risk reduction that we're seeing in action. And this is not just for wind. It's not just for hurricane that we can build. Interestingly, and this is kind of counterintuitive, and it's not sort of widely known, I think, outside of the insurance sector, we can actually build in a way that dramatically reduces our wildfire losses. So you tend to think that, okay, well, if a wildfire happens, everything that fits within the burn area of the fire burns to the ground. But in fact, it's not uncommon for only maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of homes that sit within a wildfire footprint to actually burn. So this is about a decade worth of surveys, something like 50,000 properties that CAL FIRE has surveyed in the aftermath of fires. Every one of these homes that's represented by this graph sat within a fire footprint. And what the relationship here is, the red line are the homes that were destroyed, and the blue line is the homes that had no damage. Newly built homes, meaning homes that were built after a major building code upgrade, particularly the biggest one was in 2008, there was a smaller one in 1995, are much more likely, something like twice as likely, to survive a wildfire than older homes because of these upgrades to the building code that have been made. And this is really important as we start to see wildfire in parts of the country that historically have not had to contend with it as a severe risk. So this is the Marshall Fire, which was the most destructive wildfire in Colorado history, destroyed about 1,000 homes. There's 100-mile-an-hour winds driving a grass fire. 100-mile-an-hour winds are actually not that uncommon in that area at that time of year, but normally at that time of year, there's snow on the ground. So we're taking risk into new areas that have not historically had to contend with it so much. But even in this case, there's clear things that we can do, and the choices in how we build are affecting our risk. So this is a damage survey from the aftermath of the Marshall Fire. The arrow shows the direction the wind was blowing that you just saw in that video. Where the homes on the left were largely built in 1970, and every one of those was destroyed. They were built to the building codes that were in place at the time 50 years ago. And because of those choices that were made 50 years ago, every person lost their home. But the neighborhood on the right was newly built. It was built in about 2020 with, again, newly updated building codes. And those building codes are fire resistant. They are so close to their neighbors that they literally had melted pieces of their neighbors' homes stuck to the side of their homes afterwards. Like, this is how close they came. And not a single person lost their home in that upgraded neighborhood. How we choose to build does not just affect our risk today, it affects the risk in our built environment for decades to come. So in 1970, those homes were not built for the climate of 2020. We need to make sure that what we build in 2020 is built for the climate of 2070. And unfortunately, that still is not always happening. So again, with the Marshall Fire, it turns out that there was some local news reporting in the aftermath that said that many of the homeowners associations in the areas that burned and the communities that were lost, for aesthetic reasons, required homes to have wood siding, wood shingles, and wood fences. So the video that you see running in the background is from this research facility, IBHS, showing the impact that the building materials that you choose to build a home from make. We cannot allow our communities to require you to cover your home in batches. We need to be doing more to communicate that climate change is going to impact the decisions that we have in our built environment. This is like low-hanging fruit that we can do today. And this is an area that the insurance industry is very active. So to sum up the big three concepts that we covered today: critical thresholds, small change in hazard, big impact on loss; loss multipliers and loss reducers, things that we can do to take a hazard and make it bigger or worse, or to reduce it; and the impact that building codes can have for adapting to the climate of the future. Thanks.